had always been fascinated by forgotten places, the kind that were hidden in plain sight, yet held echoes of lives and stories long past. As an urban explorer, she had built a modest online following by documenting her adventures into decayed factories, silent schools, and crumbling theaters. But Blackthorn Asylum was different. It wasn't just abandoned, it was infamous. Tales of inhumane treatments, patient revolts, and inexplicable disappearances surrounded the place, making it a beacon for thrill seekers and ghost hunters alike. It wasn't easy to get access. Blackthorn sat behind rusting iron gates on the edge of town, its perimeter guarded by warning signs and the occasional patrol. The challenge only added to its allure. For weeks, Lila had scoured forums and urban explorer groups, piecing together stories and maps of the asylum's layout. Finally, on a crisp autumn morning, she decided it was time. The drive to Blackthorn was uneventful, but as the asylum came into view, an uneasy feeling crept over her. The building loomed against the gray sky, its facade weathered and scarred by decades of neglect. Ivy had claimed much of the outer walls, its tendrils snaking over broken windows and faded stone. Even from a distance, the place radiated an air of decay and despair. She parked her car in a wooded area a few hundred yards from the entrance, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. After grabbing her backpack, packed meticulously with essentials like a flashlight, a camera, gloves, a first aid kit, and a portable charger, she made her way to the gate. The rusted iron bars groaned in protest as she pushed them open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still air. The courtyard was littered with debris. Shards of glass, rusted metal, and scraps of paper fluttered in the breeze. Graffiti covered the walls, ranging from crude tags to ominous phrases like, "Leave while you can," and "They never left." Lila snapped a few photos, her camera's shutter clicking in rapid succession. The sense of unease grew stronger with every step, but she shook it off. This was her element after all. The main entrance was surprisingly intact, its heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. Pushing them open, she stepped into a cavernous lobby. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew and rot. Shafts of light filtered through broken windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. The floor was littered with debris, and the remnants of a shattered chandelier lay in a heap near the center of the room. A grand staircase dominated the space, its once polished banisters now splintered and dull. To her left, a hallway stretched into darkness, while to her right, a doorway led to what appeared to be an administrative office. Lila hesitated, then chose the hallway, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The beam revealed peeling wallpaper, warped floorboards, and the occasional scurry of a rodent. Each step felt heavier than the last. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the floor beneath her boots. She paused to take a photo of a wheelchair positioned eerily in the center of the hallway. The leather seat was cracked, and one wheel was smeared with a rust-colored stain. A chill ran down her spine as she moved closer, her camera capturing every detail. The hallway ended in a pair of double doors, their glass panes clouded with grime. Pushing them open, she entered what appeared to be a common area. Rows of rusted chairs lined the walls, and a toppled table lay in the center of the room. The walls were covered in faded murals, their cheerful depictions of pastoral scenes marred by graffiti and age. Lila's attention was drawn to a large bulletin board on the far wall. It was filled with faded notices and photographs, many of which were too damaged to make out. One photo, however, caught her eye. It showed a group of patients and staff, their faces blurred with time. Something about the image unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She snapped a photo and moved on. The next room she entered was a small office. The desk was overturned, its drawers pulled out and emptied long ago. Papers littered the floor, and a rusted filing cabinet stood in the corner. She sifted through the mess, finding nothing of interest until she opened the cabinet. Inside was a single file, its cover yellowed and brittle. The label read, "Patient 319, Special Case." Curiosity piqued, she opened the file. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and photographs. The patient's name was redacted, but the notes described a series of bizarre incidents. hallucinations, violent outbursts, and unexplained injuries. One photograph showed a series of deep scratches on the patient's back, the marks arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. Lila's hands trembled as she read further. The final entry simply stated, "Transferred to basement treatment rooms. No further records available." The word basement lingered in her mind as she left the office. Her heart raced as she followed a set of signs pointing toward the lower levels. The stairwell was narrow and steep, its metal railing cold to the touch. The air grew colder as she descended, and the faint smell of chemicals mixed with the dampness. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a long corridor lined with doors. Most were locked or jammed shut, their paint peeling and hinges rusted. The few she managed to open revealed empty rooms filled with broken furniture and discarded medical equipment. One room, however, was different. The walls were covered in writing, scratched deeply into the plaster. Words and phrases overlapped, creating a chaotic tapestry of desperation. "They're watching. Don't trust them. We never left." The sight sent a shiver down her spine, but she forced herself to take a few photos before moving on. The corridor ended in a large set of double doors, their surface scarred and battered. Above them, a faded sign read, "Treatment Wing." Lila hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but curiosity won out. Pushing the doors open, she stepped into the darkness beyond. The treatment wing was unlike anything she had seen so far. The walls were lined with cabinets filled with vials and jars, their contents long since dried up. Metal tables with straps sat in the center of several rooms, their surfaces stained with rust and other darker substances. In one room, she found a series of journals stacked neatly on a shelf. Most were illegible, their pages warped and faded. But one stood out. Its cover was pristine, as if untouched by time. Opening it, she found a series of entries written in a hurried, desperate hand. The first few pages described routine treatments, but the tone shifted abruptly halfway through. "They're not curing us. They're experimenting on us. The walls whisper at night, telling us to leave. But we can't. They won't let us." Lila's breath quickened as she read on. The final entry chilled her to the bone. "They're coming for me. If anyone finds this, know that the asylum isn't abandoned. We're still here, trapped, and soon, you will be too." A sudden crash echoed through the corridor, breaking her concentration. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time, she considered turning back. But something compelled her to stay. She wasn't done yet. Lila tightened her grip on the flashlight, the journal still clutched in her other hand. The oppressive silence of the treatment wing now felt alive, as if the very walls were watching her. She shook her head, dismissing the thought, but the growing unease was impossible to ignore. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to move forward, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. At the end of the hallway, she encountered another door. This one was heavier, reinforced with metal and marked with a sign that read, "Restricted Access." It looked out of place compared to the rest of the asylum's crumbling architecture. A faint light flickered beneath the door, as if something inside was still operational. Her pulse quickened. The logical part of her mind urged her to turn back, but the journalist in her refused to leave without uncovering the truth. With some effort, she managed to push the door open, its hinges groaning loudly in protest. The room beyond was unlike anything she had encountered so far. It was cold and sterile, the walls lined with stainless steel cabinets and counters. Medical equipment, some of it disturbingly modern, lay scattered across the room. A large observation window dominated one wall, offering a view into a dimly lit chamber beyond. Lila stepped closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. Inside the chamber, a metal gurney sat in the center, surrounded by strange machinery. Restraints dangled from its sides, and the faint outline of something, or someone, lay motionless on the surface. Her stomach churned as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The journal in her hand suddenly felt heavier, its words echoing in her mind. "They're experimenting on us." A faint clicking sound drew her attention to a monitor on the far wall. It flickered to life, displaying a grainy black and white feed of the chamber. Her own reflection in the glass overlaid the ghostly image of the gurney, but the figure lying on it was now clearly visible. It was a man, his face obscured by a mask, his body riddled with wires and tubes. Her hands trembled as she reached for her camera, but before she could snap a photo, the monitor switched to another feed. This one showed the hallway she had just walked through. Her heart sank as she saw a shadowy figure move across the screen, heading in her direction. Panic set in. She turned off the flashlight, plunging herself into darkness, and pressed herself against the wall. Her ears strained to catch any sound, but the silence was deafening. Seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavier than the last. Finally, she mustered the courage to peek out into the hallway. It was empty. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. A faint scraping sound came from the opposite end of the corridor. She couldn't see its source, but it was growing louder, closer. Without thinking, she slipped back into the room and shut the door quietly behind her. Her eyes darted around, searching for a place to hide. A storage cabinet in the corner caught her attention, and she quickly climbed inside, pulling the door shut just as the sound reached the room. Through the slats of the cabinet door, she watched as the heavy door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, its movements unnaturally jerky. The dim light revealed a humanoid shape, but its face was obscured by a hood or mask. It moved methodically, scanning the room as if searching for something or someone. Lila held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. The figure moved closer, its heavy footsteps echoing in the small space. It paused just inches from the cabinet, and for a terrifying moment, she thought it might open the door. But then it turned and left, the door slamming shut behind it. She stayed hidden for several minutes, her body trembling with fear. When she finally emerged, the room felt even colder than before. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she was determined to find answers. The chamber on the other side of the glass seemed to hold the key. She found a control panel near the window, its buttons and switches labeled in cryptic terms. After a moment of hesitation, she pressed one marked Activate. The machinery in the chamber whirred to life, and the lights brightened, revealing more of the room's horrifying details. The man on the gurney twitched, his body convulsing as the equipment hummed and beeped. Lila's stomach churned as she realized he was still alive. The monitor flickered again, showing a new feed. This one was of another room, similar to the chamber but empty. A text overlay read, "Subject transfer in progress." Her blood ran cold as the camera panned to reveal a gurney being wheeled down a hallway. It wasn't the same man she had seen earlier. This one was a woman, her face contorted in terror. A noise behind her snapped her out of her trance. The door to the room was opening again. This time, there was no place to hide. She grabbed the journal and bolted through the nearest exit, her flashlight flickering as she ran. The corridors blurred together as she fled, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Finally, she found herself back in the main stairwell. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, growing louder with every second. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her lungs burning as she reached the main floor. The lobby was just ahead, its shattered chandelier a welcome sight. The open doors of the asylum felt like salvation, but as she stepped into the courtyard, she realized she wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden, but their intent clear. They surrounded her, their movements eerily synchronized. Lila backed away, her heart pounding as she searched for an escape route. But before she could act, one of the figures lunged at her, and everything went black. She woke up in darkness, her body restrained on a cold metal surface. The faint hum of machinery filled the air, and the smell of chemicals stung her nose. Panic set in as she struggled against the straps, her mind racing. A voice crackled through an unseen speaker, cold and emotionless. Subject 320, experiment commencing. The last thing she saw before the lights went out was a series of monitors displaying her own terrified face. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, when Emily, her boyfriend Jake, and their friends Sarah and Max decided to rent the remote Willow Creek cabin, they envisioned cozy nights by the fire and lazy mornings sipping coffee by the lake. The listing had promised peace, privacy, and a rustic charm that was hard to resist. But the cabin held secrets, ones that would turn their idyllic vacation into a nightmare. The first sign that something was amiss came as they arrived. The dirt road leading to the cabin was overgrown, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine as they pulled into the clearing. The cabin itself looked exactly as advertised: weathered wood, a wraparound porch, and a stone chimney. But something about the windows, dark and uninviting, felt wrong. "Looks cozy," Sarah said, trying to sound cheerful. "Yeah, it's perfect," Jake agreed, unloading the bags from the car. Emily forced a smile, trying to shake her unease. They were here to relax, after all. But as they stepped inside, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The interior was quaint, with old furniture and a large fireplace dominating the living room. A spiral staircase led to the upstairs bedrooms, and the kitchen was stocked with everything they needed. Yet, the silence was deafening. By the time they had unpacked and settled in, the sun was setting. Max lit a fire in the hearth while Sarah prepared dinner. Emily wandered onto the porch, drawn by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The lake, just visible through the woods, reflected the fading light like a mirror. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jake's voice startled her. She nodded. "Yeah, it is." But as she gazed at the lake, she thought she saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. She blinked, but it was gone. Shaking her head, she told herself it was nothing, just her imagination. That night, they sat around the fireplace, laughing and sharing stories. The tension of the day seemed to melt away. But as the hours passed and the flames dwindled, an unsettling feeling crept back in. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, her eyes darting to the window. "Hear what?" Max replied, his tone skeptical. "It sounded like whispering." Jake laughed. "It's probably just the wind. This place is old. Creaky wood and all that." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she let it go. They decided to call it a night, each retreating to their respective rooms. Emily and Jake took the master bedroom, while Sarah and Max stayed in the guest room across the hall. Emily's dreams were strange and disjointed. She saw the lake, its surface rippling as if something massive was moving beneath it. Shadows danced in the forest, and a voice, soft and mournful, called her name. When she woke, her heart was racing, and the room felt ice cold. Beside her, Jake was snoring softly. She glanced at the window and froze. A face, pale and expressionless, was staring in at her. She gasped, and in an instant, it was gone. Trembling, she woke Jake. "What is it?" he mumbled. "There was someone outside the window," she whispered. He groaned. "Probably just an animal. Go back to sleep." But Emily couldn't. She spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin. The next morning, Sarah and Max seemed on edge. "Did you guys hear anything last night?" Sarah asked over breakfast. "Like what?" Jake replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Footsteps. Upstairs. I thought I heard someone walking around." Emily's stomach tightened. "I saw something," she admitted. "A face at our window." Max frowned. "Are you sure? We're in the middle of nowhere. Who would be out here?" "I don't know," Emily said, her voice shaking. "But something doesn't feel right." Determined to prove there was nothing to fear, Jake and Max decided to check the property. Armed with flashlights and a sense of bravado, they ventured into the woods while the women stayed behind. Hours passed with no sign of them, and Emily's anxiety grew. When they finally returned, their faces were pale, and they refused to talk about what they'd seen. "Let's just pack up and leave," Jake said abruptly. Sarah nodded in agreement, but Emily protested. "What did you see out there?" Jake hesitated. "There's something wrong with this place. We need to go." Before they could leave, A storm rolled in, trapping them in the cabin. The wind howled and the power flickered before going out entirely. In the darkness, the whispers Sarah had heard the night before returned, louder and more distinct. They came from all around, growing into an incomprehensible chorus. Emily lit a candle, its flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We need to stick together," she said, her voice trembling. But the whispers seemed to mock her, calling her name again and again. And then came the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, descending the spiral staircase. The group huddled together in the living room, their fear palpable. The footsteps stopped, and silence fell. But then the front door creaked open, and the candle blew out. In the pitch black, Emily felt something brush past her. She screamed, and the others joined in, their cries swallowed by the storm. When the lights flickered back on, they were alone. The door was closed, and the room looked untouched. The old forest trail near Brookhaven had always been a place of mystery. Locals avoided it, whispering tales of people who ventured in and never came back. But for Amy, Mark, and David, the legends were nothing more than exaggerated stories, chilling but entirely fictional. Or so they thought. The three friends were avid hikers, always seeking new adventures. When Mark suggested exploring the Vanishing Trail, Amy hesitated. "It's called the Vanishing Trail for a reason," she said, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. David grinned, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Come on, Amy. It's just a hike. We'll stick together, and if it gets too creepy, we'll turn back." Mark nodded. "Exactly. Besides, think of the bragging rights. We'll be the first people to conquer the Vanishing Trail." Reluctantly, Amy agreed, and the trio set off early the next morning. The entrance to the trail was marked by an old wooden sign, weathered and almost illegible. It read, "Enter at your own risk." The forest was dense, with towering pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier with every step. "Why is it so quiet?" Amy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shrugged, but his usual bravado was absent. "Maybe the birds are shy," he joked, though it fell flat. David checked his GPS. "We're making good time. The trail loops back around in about 5 miles, so we'll be out before dark." As they continued, the path became harder to follow. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Amy shivered despite the warm afternoon. "This place feels wrong," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Like we're being watched." David tried to reassure her. "It's just your imagination. Trails like this always feel a bit spooky." But Amy wasn't convinced, and soon neither was David. An hour in, they came across something odd. A rusted bicycle, leaning against a tree, its frame tangled in vines. Nearby, an old backpack lay discarded, its contents strewn across the ground. "Looks like someone was here recently," Mark said, though his tone lacked confidence. David crouched to examine the backpack. "It's been here a while. The fabric's brittle." Amy frowned. "If this stuff is old, where's the person who left it?" No one had an answer. The uneasy silence returned as they pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last. By mid-afternoon, they reached a fork in the trail. David's GPS glitched, the screen flickering before going blank. "Great," he muttered, smacking the device. "Now what?" Mark pointed to the left path. "That one looks more traveled. Let's try it." Amy hesitated. "Shouldn't we turn back? We don't know where this leads." "We've come this far," Mark argued. "We'll be fine." Reluctantly, Amy followed. But as they walked, the trail grew increasingly strange. The trees twisted unnaturally, their trunks covered in deep, claw-like gouges. The air felt heavy, making it hard to breathe. "Does anyone else feel that?" Amy asked, her voice trembling. David nodded. "Yeah. It's like the air's thicker. Mark tried to brush it off. It's just the altitude or something. Let's keep moving. But deep down, he felt it too. Something was very wrong. As dusk approached, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. "This wasn't on the map," David said, frowning. Mark smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe it's a landmark. Let's check it out." Amy grabbed his arm. "Number. We've already seen enough weird stuff. Let's just go back." "We need to find our way," Mark insisted. "Maybe there's something in there that can help." Reluctantly, they approached the cabin. The air grew colder as they stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and the smell of decay was overpowering. On the walls were faded photographs of a family. Their faces were blurred, but their eyes seemed to follow the group as they moved. A table in the center of the room held a single unlit candle and a rusted knife. "Let's get out of here," Amy whispered, backing toward the door. But before they could leave, the door slammed shut. The temperature plummeted, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the cabin. "What was that?" David asked, his voice barely audible. Mark grabbed the knife from the table, holding it out defensively. "Stay close. We'll find another way out." But as they turned, the growling grew louder, coming from every direction. Shadows danced along the walls, moving independently of the flickering light. Panic set in as they realized they were no longer alone.